Brussels Bites, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Center with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi, and welcome back to Brussels Bites. I'm your host Dimitar, and together with the Martin Center, we are continuing our journey across the still uncharted waters of technology and European policy. In our last episode, we had a fantastic conversation about Nietzsche, nihilism, and why technology is partly to blame for some of our personal anxieties and also the polarization we see in the online information space. In today's episode, we entered the world of finance and services. How is financial technology, or Fintech, disrupting the world of finance and potentially changing the way we handle money, investment, and much more? What is happening globally when we talk about Fintech, and how is Europe adapting to innovation in the world of finance? I'm happy to be joined by Tsvetelina Kuzmanova, who recently completed a research paper for the Martin Center with the title Fine-Tuning Europe, How to Win the Global Fintech Race. You can find the paper online on our website. Tsvetelina Kuzmanova is an international cooperation expert at the non-banking financial regulator in Bulgaria, where she is involved in EU legislation initiatives and cross-border cooperation. Previously, she worked on international development projects in Asia and Africa. Her academic background is in international development at the University of Cambridge and political science and diplomacy at Yonsei University, South Korea. Tsvetelina, I'm happy to have you as our guest on our podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here as well.
So let's start. Can you tell us what is fintech, what is financial technology, and why is it becoming a buzzword in the financial sector globally?
Fintech is becoming a buzzword. Everyone seems to be talking about it. And I think the hype around it is probably mostly due to the Bitcoin and the recent news from the past couple of years on how popular cryptocurrencies are becoming. But I would say that for me personally, and I would say for most of the people using some sort of financial products or services, it is because the technology is already in our pockets. In our mobile phones, we can transfer money, we can use different sorts of applications, different sorts of products. Even when you file a claim for a car accident, this is already fintech technology and development. So I think that's why it's becoming very popular due to consumers' needs. They drive it.
Great. And so when we talk about fintech, it's not only about payments. Am I correct?
Yes. Usually, the fintech technology is most developed in the sector of financial payments, like mobile payments and internet-based payments. But they're increasingly developing new technologies to accommodate other parts of the financial sector. For example, insurance, as I mentioned, banking, also the cryptocurrencies is a new development there. So they're really entering the technological developments are really entering the financial sector, I would say, in all sorts of ways, not only payments.
On the face of it, fintech and all the examples you're giving sounds like a great boost for consumers. It's quite useful, I'm sure. How are the big commercial actors like banks responding to this? Isn't this a threat for the long-standing institutions we used to rely on?
Yes and no, I would say. These developments are, especially with payments, they're happening mostly because the incumbent institutions, the traditional banks, are failing in many ways. There are a lot of underbanked citizens in all parts of the world, including Europe. So this is the reason why people are utilizing and starting using these kind of technologies. And to a large extent, yeah, that can be seen as a threat to the traditional banking system. But I think they're already ahead of us in all of the technological developments in the sector, because the traditional banks are either already possessing some of the technology. They're either developing it in-house or buying the fintech startups that are developing these pieces of technology. So to a large extent, there is it's not about competition with these kind of companies. It's about cooperation or mutual benefit for both parties.
Okay. Can you touched upon payments, insurance. Can you give us a couple of more examples? How does this technology really operate, or how is it actually operational?
Okay, yeah. With payments, yeah, obviously you have like mobile payments, non-banking mobile payments, but it's probably worth mentioning also the developments in terms of artificial intelligence, big data analytics, machine learning, because these are uncharted territories yet. And I think the future of the fintech developments would be related to how much information a part your company has, how well they analyze it, what kind of algorithms they have, what kind of connections they make, and how they capitalize on it, how they monetize the data. So I think this is something interesting to be looking into in the future. And for instance, against to jump to insurance, for example, the big data that you have from the black boxes in the cars or the telematics, like the wearable devices, like these sports bracelets, telematics.
I think Fitbit, for example.
Yeah, those kind of wearables. The information that you gather from these, it's incredible what you can do with it, and it's the same with payments as well. If a company has that kind of information for a large portion of the population, and they can have the right algorithm in place to analyze these connections, you can very easily have unimaginable connections that you cannot even imagine. You can have, for example, based someone's credit score or someone's insurance premium on their behavior, on what they buy. When they press the brake at the car, like what kind of roads they're driving on, how well they're eating, how they're exercising. Like all these things can create connections and be utilized in one way or another.
And here it gets interesting and maybe a bit even risky and dystopian for some people, that they might say this, because the access to this data means that, let's say, a person with bad health habits, for example, or a reckless driver, let's say, this might show up on the algorithm because of the data which is supplied to the algorithm. And this person might be penalized with, let's say, a higher insurance premium or more costly car insurance, whatever. So what are the implications when we talk about privacy? And would you say that this is something which is still a bit uncharted, and something which is a bit maybe causing anxiety for some people?
Yeah, I would definitely say that we're already living the dystopian reality, and people in most cases are not really aware of the implications of this. I accept the terms and conditions tick box that I have no idea how many times I've done it only this week without reading the terms and conditions.
And giving your consent to something which
obviously. And the implications are huge. I mean, of course, Europe is very proud and the whole world is jealous of the GDPR that we have in place. But the reality is that very often we don't even have the information to what we consent to. Just to give you an example, because the examples that you mentioned are very relevant, but this is information that you can more or less make the connections between the different parts of the algorithm. If you're eating unhealthy, maybe your insurance will be skewed to that side or this or that side of the spectrum, but. There can be even dependent sources of information that you cannot really predict or explain. For example, there have been a study that shows that algorithm makes the connection between whether you're an iPhone user or an Android user, and how likely you are to default on your credit payments, installments, for example. So this is something that, taken into company or bank policy, would affect you in a way that you cannot even imagine, only because somewhere that you've used your phone, it says that, oh, this person is an iPhone user, so they're, for example, less likely to default on their payments. And this is only the commercial side of it. The implications when it comes to advertising, to really tangible impacts on your lifestyle, this is when it gets really scary. And after all, we're living here in Europe, where we have some safeguards, but if you're living in China, where most of these developments are happening on a larger scale than here in Europe, this can be pretty scary, I think, in terms of data privacy.
We're going to talk about European policy maybe in a bit, but I just want to follow up on China. How is the fintech sector developing in Asia? And is it true that China is actually leading the race when we talk about financial technology?
If we see the world in terms of regional significance and developments, I would say, yeah, that Europe is definitely falling behind the US and the Asia-Pacific regions and China mostly. It depends what parameters you look into, because in many aspects the US is leading the way. I mean, their financial system is much more mature than the rest of the world. But with China in particular, I think it's very interesting that the majority of the population there is already using some sort of fintech technology, if I can say so. And it's the adoption rate among Chinese is over 87%, wasn't it?
I think in your paper you show data that they're actually on the top of when it comes to mobile user adoption.
They're at the top of the chart when it comes to adoption, and this is mainly because a majority of not the majority, but a large portion of the population is underbanked there, and they're always having their mobile
by
phones.
Underbanked you mean that they don't own a credit card or an account?
Yes, they don't have access to some formal banking institution or services, financial services. And the majority of the people are with their hands, with their phone in their hands. I mean, what the Chinese companies, I hope we can also talk a little bit on the big tech companies around the world. But what is happening in China is the majority of the population is already using the new technology. You have it really integrated in your phone, your social media platforms, your payment services, your investment financial products and services, mobile wallets, like all these things are already integrated. So yeah, this is, I would say, where China, I would say, is on the forefront of developments in the
when it comes
fintech.
to user adoption. That's a very interesting point. I've also read some stats on this, that exactly China, I think, is globally one of the countries which has the most people without a banking account, which causes lots of problems, not only for everyday payments, but also in terms of credit history, bank loans, and so on. So it's interesting because China is essentially leapfrogging a stage of let's say, normal development in many other countries, completely circumventing the banking route and now just jumping ahead with fintech. Do you think this is positive? And I also want to add in that you've also lived in South Korea, if I'm not mistaken. And what's your experience in living in Asia, and what's the attitude of the population towards financial services, mobile payments, and so on?
It's probably a terrible generalization of the whole of Asia, but I would say that at least when I lived in Seoul in South Korea, the population there, the people are very digitally savvy, and they really use all these new technologies that are new to us. I've been using them in South Korea since 2010, things that are really entering the market here in Europe now. So I would say that you have a huge population there. The majority of the middle class I think by 2030, the majority of the middle class, 66% I think of the world middle class will be living in Southeast Asia, in Asia Pacific.
This is groundbreaking, no?
It is quite big, and these are people with increasingly better purchasing power. People, usually younger people, who really are digitally savvy, and they really can use the new technologies, and they get used to the new technologies really quickly. But I would also say that I think it is very standard for the people there to use your mobile phone for everything. I mean, in 2000, I remember even as early as 2010, when I first arrived there, people were already using mostly mobile payments or cards for some sort. It was almost like a cashless society. And I've seen that in China and Korea, maybe not so much in Japan, I think. But the governments and the people are seriously pushing for this concept of cashless society. Well, everything will be transferred online and everything will be digital.
And here again, we come to the topic we talked 5 minutes ago about online privacy, because in the Chinese case, yes, for example, WeChat, which is a very popular app, it combines social media, photos, news
conveniently
feeds,
integrated,
and also
for the
financial
government
wallets.
as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's more and more evidence that the government is pushing the population to use this app, because also it can monitor the purchases and it can monitor everyday life. So this is something we have to be mindful about. No?
I think people don't really have in mind this idea of how valuable our financial information actually is, and how much information can come out of your financial data. Everything that you buy, everywhere you go, everything that you spend money on can be translated into this or that type of either company or government policy. So this is something that we should really be careful about. This is also probably why I find the whole concept of a global digital currency very frustrating. I'm both very curious and extremely scared about it. I'm talking about the Libra project. The Facebook.
Just to add in, this is in 2019, Facebook announced that they're planning to do their Libra project, which...
Well, it's the idea of having like a global digital currency, which is based on the blockchain technology, open source. And it is supposed to be backed by Libra Reserve, which is governed by an association of different partners and companies. So it's not supposed to be only Facebook, but for me, having like a social media platform with the user base of over 2 billion,
2.2 billion people.
Yeah, billion people around the world, and using the information there to kickstart like one of the biggest financial innovations in the world. Like basically, it's with the magnitude of a government currency. And it's not subject to any sort of regulation or a central bank or any kind of control. So I think that's why it has been met with a lot of skepticism, especially here in Europe, from France and Germany, I think, initially. Facebook announced introduced Calibra, which is supposed to be a subsidiary of the of Facebook that will be responsible for the development of technological of financial services, like a wallet for for all their application, for Messenger, for
So you go on your Messenger app, and there's also an additional wallet for payments, correct? That's the idea.
Yes, I think so. And also the WhatsApp and Messenger. I think the idea here with Calibra is to divide the financial information, financial data from the social media platform data, which sounds great in theory, but the mere fact that you need to introduce such a subsidiary to do that thing in particular, I don't know about you, I'm not really buying it.
And also a company like Facebook, which has a history of breaching privacy
exactly.
on a monstrously huge scale in the last couple of years. I'm also not very optimistic. But just to wrap up on Libra, it's still not operational. There's been lots of pushback from national regulators on this. And just an interesting update, I think in January, a couple of big companies who were backing the project decided to drop out. Companies like Vodafone, Visa, and MasterCard. And here I have a very interesting quote from the CEO of MasterCard, who actually questioned how is Facebook going to make profit and actually manage the currency. And he said, and I quote, "When you don't understand how money gets made, it gets made in ways you do not like." So...
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And from the white paper, it's very well written white paper for Libra. And what you can gather is that they were trying to basically control the volatility, which is very common for cryptocurrencies, by backing it up with this basket of low volatility assets like government bonds and all sorts of other assets. But the fact that in the association there were these companies that you mentioned, the fact that even companies that were initially in are starting to question how coins will be minted and so on, I think this is already telling enough for the future of the project, maybe.
Great. I would like to bring the conversation back to Europe. Well, we touched upon the States, we touched upon Asia. So maybe let's focus on our own backyard. What is the situation in Europe when it comes to fintech? And are European startups and entrepreneurs catching up with this global wave?
Well, definitely in Europe there is an increased interest in the topic. I think what is really really interesting about our market in Europe is that the fintech companies, first of all, there are different types of financial institutions or different types of companies that participate in the development or the provision of fintech solutions. And this can be banks, traditional banks, as I mentioned. What is common for Europe, like the smaller fintech companies, more like technological companies that develop the technology that is used for the products and services. And then you have like the big tech companies like Facebook and financial, for example, in China, which is notably one of the biggest one in the world. So I think our market does not have, it's obvious that our market does not have these big players. Like in the US, they're called GAFA, Google,
Correct, yeah.
Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, and it's BAT in China. It's Baidu and financial, and Tencent. Tencent is also quite big.
Some people, sorry to interrupt, say that the next decades are going to be dominated by GAFAs with bats or bats with fangs. So yeah.
Well, we're missing on the whole party here in Europe, I would say, because here we don't really have these kind of like really huge, big, globally operating social media like technology companies, which is can be a drawback, but can also be really positive for the development of our market, because I think in cooperation with traditional banking institutions or with these foreign social media platforms and technological companies, I think we can also really nurture our market. Okay, to be fair, we are falling behind in terms of developments here. Our adoption rate is not as high in Europe of the new technology. The investments are not as big as in the States or in China. Companies are much smaller and with not that huge market valuation. Generally, you, I think, can look into how significant different parts of the world are in terms of fintech through how developed their so-called fintech hubs are. So globally, I think in the past couple of years, there is global fintech hub index that ranks the different cities around the world in terms of their significance with fintech. And there are like 30 that are really developed with serious either global or regional significance. And of them, the first 7 are like really global fintech hubs, where you have lots of investments, a lot of business, a lot of companies developing different sorts of technology. You have the talent, you have the people there. And these are basically number 1, Beijing. Then you have San Francisco, New York, London, and the rest is all in China.
And we just lost London a couple. Yeah.
And yeah, well, when it comes to geographically, it's still in Europe, but when it comes to EU policies and regulation and governance, yeah, we lost that. Yeah, the biggest fintech hubs are not in Europe, and of these 30 that I mentioned, there are several further down the list that are in Europe and have huge potential. These include, for example, Paris, Stockholm, Berlin, Zurich, Amsterdam. There are some also emerging ones that in the next couple of years can really get really developed. For instance, Vilnius, I think it was very interesting. Warsaw, Frankfurt, obviously a big financial center in Europe. But the reality is that the majority of where these developments are happening are outside of Europe, and they're mainly for the biggest part, they're mainly in China and the US. But once again, in China, they're really more developed in terms of government backing and spending and investments.
Citizen adoption and optimism to use it.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
what can Europe do when we talk about policy, when we talk about specific strategies and measures? What can be done on European level so we can actually boost our ranking?
Well, I think definitely government policies and both national and on EU level can really have an impact. Because from what I've seen in different parts of the world, for example, data policies or government investments nurturing and government spending on different projects and different initiatives can be really important and boost the development in the sector. So what we have right now in Europe is, I would say, unexploited single market in that particular field. We have a huge single market in Europe, and we have very fragmented, not really specific to nurturing policies in the different countries. Obviously, every authority, every government is trying to strike the right balance between nurturing this, creating an enabling environment while also dealing with money laundering issues, financing terrorism, and protecting the consumers and the investors. But I think in Europe we definitely need right now a more overarching strategy on how to do that. The way is already paved by some directives for the financial sector that really set the tone for a common financial sector convergence in that sector. For instance, we have the Payment Services Directive, PSD2. We have some regulatory reporting standards through several other directives. We have the GDPR for data protection. So we can take that and I think come up with a common fintech strategy for the whole of Europe. Right now, regulators in Europe are already developing different strategies, having these so-called innovation hubs or sandboxes. These are like innovation facilitators for the financial sector, where companies and the business can come together with the regulator and explore and discuss the new services and products. And yeah, last year, I think in March 2018, the European Commission came up with the Fintech action plan, very ambitious. I think they had 19 particular strategies and actions on how to achieve this. But so far, I think in terms of legislation, we're really lagging behind. The only thing legislative that has come out of the FinTech Action Plan is the crowdfunding platform legislation. So I think there is a lot to be done in that particular area when it comes to European level initiatives.
So it's been 2 years and the Commission hasn't really done its homework when it comes to fintech, and maybe the member states also haven't really responded properly.
Well, a lot has been done. For example, there's the EU FinTech Lab, which connects regulators and government bodies with the business to discuss different technologies. There's the European Facilitator, Financial Innovation Facilitator, I think FFIF, which is like a forum for EU regulators to come together and discuss ideas and to have some level of convergence of their ideas. A lot has been done in terms of assessing the licensing barriers, for example, or what can be done to facilitate this, how to respond to different risks and vulnerabilities. But I think what we are really missing is how to really boost these companies, these fintech companies, and how to improve their competitiveness globally.
Final question, as we're running out of time, if you can provide a couple of key recommendations on the European level when we talk about fintech, what would they be?
I think the first one that I already mentioned is that we need an overarching strategy for the whole of Europe and how to make the best out of the single market. I think also it would be good to focus on data and how data is used and how where it comes from and how it is used, because I don't think we can and we should regulate the technology itself. What I think we can do is focus on competition and where this competition comes from, and who generates, possesses, and controls the data. So I don't think we can really compete with the big techs and all the data that they have, but we could potentially focus on how to better make this data available to other parts of other companies or fintech companies. Open banking is something interesting that PSD2 introduced, and I think something in that direction would be really useful. There are all sorts of different strategies that can help nurture the enabling environment for these developments in Europe. I think maybe focusing on these like cutting edge, really disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence, having the right algorithms in place, big data analytics. There are certain parts of fintech that governments in the EU can particularly target. Also, I think it's a topic that needs to be addressed at all sorts of different levels, including the talent we have in Europe. How do we attract more talent? How do we train people to go into this particular sector? How much investments do we have in that sector? In China, for example, it's not a secret that the development of the fintech industry there has been booming largely due to direct government investments through state-owned funds, for instance. So we need to think about the money, the people, the regulatory framework that is conducive to development in that sector.
Fantastic. Tsvetelina Kuzmanova, thank you very much for joining our podcast. Dear listeners, if you want to know more or read more on the topic, please download or catch up with Tsvetelina's recent report, Fine-Tuning Europe, How to Win the Global FinTech Race, available on the Martin Center website. Thank you for tuning in and join us next month.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bites.